Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, produced in cooperation with CKUW-FM Radio in Winnipeg and the Centre for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca. And here's your host, Michael Welch.
What is the humanitarian toll on civilians in Damascus and other Syrian cities, and who is primarily responsible? How accurate are the accounts of civilian atrocities taking place in Syria at the hands of the Assad government? Are the UN and human rights organizations like Amnesty International compromised in their reporting on the Syrian conflict? What is known about the motives of the US and other foreign powers in intervening in Syria through their various militant proxies? If the overthrow of Assad was the goal of U.S. military planners, then what is their plan B in the event of failure, and how are the Syrian Kurds involved? On this week's Global Research News Hour, we take a detailed look at the most recent developments in the Syrian conflict. We hear from journalist Eva Bartlett about the Western propaganda campaign. We get an on-the-ground report from journalist Tom Duggan in Damascus, and probe the geostrategy in play with Patrick Henningsen of 21st Century Wire. On this week's program, the truth and lies of the Syrian conflict. Conversations with Eva Bartlett, Tom Duggan, and Patrick Henningsen. Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of March 9th, 2018. I'm series host and producer Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a special radio collaboration between the Center for Research on Globalization and campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg on occupied Anishinaabe territory on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We seek to provide you with access to analysis of the major issues shaping our world today, from thinkers, researchers, and unique political personalities rarely addressed by major media. Our program is available for download from the Center's website, globalresearch.ca. We'll begin our show with News Notes, a sampling of articles from the Global Research News site. All of the demonization campaigns against Assad have proven false. The Saidnaya torture evidence is fraudulent, the Caesar kills his own people photo evidence is fraudulent, and Assad does not gas his own people either. The only monsters in the whole dirty war are the West and their allies. We are the ones committing the supreme international crime. We are the ones fabricating the war narratives, and we, the people, are accomplices in our government's crimes when we fail to denounce them. That comes from the article, Entering the Ring of War Propaganda by Mark Taliano, posted March 8th. People around the world keep asking us, where is the anti-war movement in the United States? You guys are the aggressors, so why aren't you doing anything about what your country is doing all around the world? So having this kind of energy around this military parade, this gross display and the glorification of militarism, is an opportunity for us in the United States to show the world that there is opposition to U.S. empire and wars of aggression, including these so-called humanitarian interventions that so many progressives are supporting. And in addition to having protests in Washington, D.C., we're reaching out to our international allies around the world and asking them to hold actions on that day as well. That was an excerpt from an interview with Margaret Flowers by Ann Garrison under the headline, The No Trump Military Parade, posted March 8th, originally appearing at Black Agenda Report. If you want to campaign on the climate, war, rainforest destruction, or any other issue that brings us closer to extinction, consider developing a comprehensive nonviolent strategy to do so. See Nonviolent Campaign Strategy. And if you want to participate in the worldwide effort to end violence in all of its manifestations, you are welcome to consider signing the online pledge of the People's Charter to create a nonviolent world. In summary, the primary threat faced by humanity is not the synergistic multitude of complex social, political, economic, and technological forces that are precipitating our rush to extinction. The fundamental threat to our survival is our psychological incapacity, particularly because of our fear, self-hatred, and powerlessness, to perceive reality and respond powerfully to it by formulating and implementing appropriate social, political, economic, and technological measures that address our multifaceted crisis systematically. That comes from the article, Homo sapiens on Track to Extinction? Climate and Nuclear Threats, Can Humanity Survive? By Robert J. Burrows, posted March 8th. This was a message delivered not just to the Russian Federal Assembly, but to the White House and its temperamental occupant, President Donald Trump, to the halls of Congress, where Russia baiting has become a full-time occupation, and to the American people, who have been caught up in a wave of anti-Russia hysteria, fueled by fantastical claims of a Russian attack on American democracy, which, when balanced against the potential of thermonuclear annihilation, pales into insignificance. Putin spoke, and one would hope that throughout America the modern-day incarnations of Verizon's Paul Marcarelli are making their way into the homes of every American citizen and the halls of power where those the American people elect to represent them reside, and calling out, "Can you hear me now?" Based upon the reaction to Putin's speech so far, the answer appears to be no. This refusal to accept the fact that there exists today a new reality carries with it the potential for catastrophic miscalculation. That comes from the article, Are You Listening, America? If the button is pushed, there's no running away, by Scott Ritter, posted March 8th, originally appearing at TruthDig. While a full-scale global trade war has yet to break out, the major powers are maneuvering for an impending conflict. Yesterday, European Union Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström said the EU would take the case to the World Trade Organization and work with others if Trump went ahead. The EU, she confirmed, has drawn up a list of products that would be subject to tariffs to the tune of 2.83 billion euros if the US proceeds. The targets could include certain types of bourbon and food products such as peanut butter, cranberries, and orange juice, as well as Harley-Davidson motorbikes. Malmström said she was reluctant to use the term trade war, and the EU did not, quote, want this to go out of proportion, unquote. That comes from the article, Trade Conflict Heats Up Towards a Full-Scale Global Trade War by Nick Beams, posted March 8th, originally appearing at World Socialist website. These are just a few of the featured articles appearing last week on the Global Research website. Regular visitors to the site are encouraged to send monetary contributions by fax, mail, or online. Just go to globalresearch.ca and click Donate on the menu bar. The portrait of Syria we see in the mainstream and even a lot of alternative media is very much at odds with the realities we have discussed on this program over the last couple of years. The conflict continues to be presented as a civil war in which the Assad regime is brutalizing the population and using chemical weapons against them while somehow managing to prevail in internationally monitored elections. To help understand the success with which Western anti-Assad powers have waged this propaganda campaign against Syria, the Global Research NewsHour got hold of Eva Bartlett. Eva Bartlett is a Canadian independent journalist and activist. She spent years on the ground covering conflict zones in the Middle East, especially in Syria and Palestine. She is recipient of the International Journalism Award for International Reporting from the Mexican Press Club in 2017. Bartlett maintains that the major press have based their assertions about the Syrian conflict on unreliable and partisan sources.
There was a series of activists, including American Bilal Abdul-Karim, who pretends to be a neutral and independent journalist and is solely embedded in terrorist-held areas, including Al-Qaeda, who has met the Saudi terrorist Abdullah Muhaisini, and who basically praises their tactics, including suicide bombings. So media had presented people like himself and others in Aleppo that were in terrorist-held areas, like the child wonder Ban al-Abid. The media was presenting them as neutral and independent voices depicting what was happening on the ground in Aleppo. And as I've made a point of mentioning it many, many times already in interviews and writings, the media did not mention the 1.5 million people in Greater Aleppo, nor the over 4,000 doctors in Greater Aleppo, nor the fact that hospitals in Greater Aleppo were being attacked by, and people were being killed and injured in these attacks by terrorist factions in Aleppo's east. So even in the lead-up, in 2016, Aleppo was one of the most propagandized cities in Syria.
A recurring theme presented by the press and human rights organizations is the specter of the Syrian government withdrawing food and medical aid to the suffering citizens in East Aleppo and the town of Madaya. Bartlett, who returned to Madaya last summer, claims that it was the rebel factions in control and not the Syrian government that was responsible for depriving the residents of these supplies.
When I went there in June 2017, civilians there told me, just like in East Aleppo, and just like I'm positive we're going to hear in Ghouta when it's finally liberated, civilians told me there was food that entered. The Syrian government allowed food. It sent food in, and it also allowed aid agencies to send food in. But we didn't have, the civilians, this is them, me paraphrasing them, did not have access to the food because the terrorist factions or the militants, they took food. And if they sold it to us, they sold it at prices we could not afford. And when I went to Madaya, I saw above a bomb factory that the terrorists were using to manufacture mortars and missiles to fire on the Syrian army and on any civilians below them, because this was in a hillside town. Above that factory was a storage room, which at least one storage room, where they had kept the food and aid supplies that came into Madaya. And there was media. There was Russian media, Murat Gazdiev with RT, and of course Syrian journalists who our media completely dismisses, who went to Madaya in January 2016 and who saw and took photos and videos of food aid entering Madaya, and who spoke with civilians who were protesting the presence of these terrorists stealing their food. But Western media completely dismissed them and ran with this narrative that the Syrian government was starving civilians in Madaya. So, as I said, the same thing occurred in Aleppo, and when journalists finally went there, Syrian independent journalists, Russian media, unfortunately, the only Western media that I'm aware of that actually deigned to tell the truth was surprisingly Reuters. And they have a clip interviewing civilians saying the terrorists stole our food. And they show a storage of food boxes. Just yesterday, I believe it was, RUPI, which is affiliated with RT, reported on food aid going into Al-Ghouta. And even the ICRC, the Red Cross spokesman, said food aid had been sent in. But in April 2016, when all the media relying on Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, MSF, said that the Syrians or the Russians had deliberately targeted and destroyed, reduced to rubble, a hospital named Al-Quds in the Sukri district of Aleppo. And this was used to again vilify the Syrians and the Russians and to call for intervention or a no-fly zone. That hospital was not destroyed. I saw it with my own eyes, and months before I saw it in June 2017, a Syrian doctor I know saw it, and a Frenchman named Pierre Lecour saw it and documented it. So there's no way that it was destroyed and rebuilt. It was never destroyed, but in that instance, MSF relied on whatever nefarious Al-Qaeda or whatever linked source that fed MSF this information. And I suspect that WHO has relied on this information as well. And the United Nations is, in my opinion, deliberately participating in war propaganda. Because I recently wrote an article after I came across this statement issued on February 20th, and it was issued by UNICEF's Regional Director of Middle East and North Africa, and the statement was one of outrage, and it was called "The War on Syria, on Children in Syria: Reports of Mass Casualties Amongst Children in Eastern Ghouta and Damascus." And so that statement was essentially just blank lines and some words. No words will do justice to the children killed. Now, it did mention Damascus at the end, but obviously the implication was Eastern Ghouta, because that statement then recycled in all the different Western corporate media outlets that were citing claims of 400,000 civilians trapped in Ghouta being starved by the Syrian government. None of these outlets, first of all, can provide sources for their number. Where do they get this 400,000? It could be the case, or it could be inflated, as was the case in eastern Aleppo, where even the United Nations said 250 to 300,000 civilians trapped in East Aleppo, and it was half that number, if not less than half that number, when we finally had access to East Aleppo. So that's question one. Where do you get this definitive statement of 400,000 civilians there? But moreover, why, corporate media, are you not mentioning, and this is a completely rhetorical question because I know, why are you not mentioning the presence of Ahrar al-Sham, Faylaq al-Rahman, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist factions in eastern Ghouta? And why are you not mentioning that some civilians have actually been able to flee, escape at their own peril, being attacked, with these terrorist factions bombing humanitarian corridors, as 2 children recently escaped from eastern Ghouta?
You should be able to have easily access to those who make it to Damascus, no?
Well, so the Syrian and Russians have opened, just like they did in Aleppo, they've opened humanitarian corridors. And it's the terrorist factions within who are not allowing civilians to leave. And since you asked for my own personal examples, before Aleppo was liberated, I met a father and a man and a woman who had numerous children who had tried a couple of times to escape their area of Aleppo, Al-Halak, and they had been prevented by the terrorist factions, and finally they and 40 others, one night, while there were clashes between the terrorists and the Syrian army, they were able to escape. And then later on, there's a lot more documentation of people trying to flee and being prevented by these terrorist factions. And that is what's happening in Ghouta. Also in Aleppo, in November when I was in Aleppo, on one of the humanitarian corridors, the Castello Road, it was shelled twice while I was standing there on the road, and 5 more times after security had told me and the others that were there to leave. So this is clear, and it wasn't the first time. It had happened weeks before, heavy shelling on various humanitarian corridors. Yet the media is portraying the Syrian government as showing no will whatsoever for to guarantee the safety of civilians, and that's completely not true. The Syrian government and Russians and all the allies are working to ensure the most peaceful solution possible.
There's one particular anecdote I'd like you to bring up. There was a child who became somewhat iconic, Omran Dagnish. You had a chance to talk to his father.
Well, so the official narrative coming out of corporate media was that Omran Dagnish was the face of suffering, Syrian suffering. He was the poster child of suffering, and terrorist groups even used him for their cause, their propaganda cause. And the story was that he was injured, perhaps gravely injured, and sat in this ambulance bleeding and looking terrified, and that he was injured in a Russian or Syrian airstrike. But Mr. Dagnish said there were no planes flying, there was no airstrike, his son was not gravely injured, he was mildly injured, and he himself was mildly injured. There was some sort of explosion. It's believed that it was one of the terrorist factions that fired some sort of explosive at their area, and that while he was rounding up members of the family in the dark to put them all together in one safe room, his boy Amran was snatched by someone and eventually ended up put in the ambulance by white helmets and photographed. So if we're to believe that these white helmets, so-called Syrian civil defense, known more aptly as Al-Qaeda's rescuers, if we're to believe that they had the well-being of Omran Dagnish in mind, why did they sit him in an ambulance and not give him any medical care while they photographed him? And by the way, the man whose photo of Omran Dagnish went viral, that man's name was Mahmoud Raslan, and he has ties to, seems to be friends with Nuruddin al-Zinki, who in summer of 2016 beheaded a Palestinian child, Abdullah Isa. And when Mahmoud Raslan was interviewed by Western corporate media, he said he cried for children like Omran. And it's supremely hypocritical because he took a grinning selfie with the child beheaders of Nuruddin al-Zinki. So in any case, Mr. Dagnish, Omran's father, said his son had been exploited by the media, and he said they traded in our blood. And I won't be surprised when similar stories coming out of Ghouta, when we find out the truth about certain stories we're hearing about Ghouta.
I think the public is generally primed to distrust certain narratives coming from the President Trump or President Bush or Obama or even Prime Minister Trudeau. And of course, they might be suspicious of CNN, Washington Post, or Norwegian journalists from certain corporate outlets, but they're not as inclined to be critical of Amnesty International or the United Nations or Democracy Now! So I'm wondering what what you could possibly say, especially as somebody who's been criticized for being conflicted, working for the Russians and such. What could you say to listeners that would shake their confidence in those entities? How are they compromised in terms of their ability to give us the straight goods on Syria?
I would highly recommend that listeners look up the writings and interviews of Professor Francis Boyle, Professor of International Law. I myself interviewed him a month or two ago, and he himself was on the board, I might get this wrong, of Amnesty USA, I believe it was. And in the lead up to the first Iraq War, he was warning them not to publish this report based on what we now know is the fake incubator baby story issued by the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, who made up the ridiculous story about babies being taken out of their incubators. Professor Boyle said to Amnesty, paraphrasing, that the report was seriously flawed, that he did not believe its accuracy, and that it would lead to the loss of lives. It would fuel the Western desire to go to war, and it did. And Amnesty refused to listen to them. And I've read other accounts of Amnesty essentially shilling for war. When you look at the makeup of Amnesty, at one point, I don't know if she's still affiliated with Amnesty, but Susan Nozel was, I might be wrong about this, but I think she was affiliated with the U.S. State Department. I do have on my blog a page, it needs updating, but it was devoted to the different humanitarian actors or fake human rights groups that essentially shill for war. And Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and a number of others like Avaz, which is an online campaign that often does petitions, and often their petitions have to do with calling for no-fly zones in places like Syria. These are effectively serving as the human face for intervention in the country that's being warred upon. So, I mean, I can send you that link. That might be the easiest thing. But it is, for example, the head of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, has knowingly put out photos and videos of other places and purported they were Aleppo. And he took one video from eastern Gaza, from a district called Shujai, and he said this was Aleppo under Assad's bombs. And for somebody who is the head of Human Rights Watch to put out a video with that statement, that is not, if that is just simple negligence, then that shows how much credit we should give any report coming from that body. But I think it's more than negligence. I'm positive that it was intentional. He's done that since. What I wanted to say, though, with regards to the UN, this statement of outrage that I mentioned, it did not, I looked for other statements of outrage, perhaps pertaining to the terrorist shelling of Damascus, which is happening on a daily basis. And you have tens of people being killed over the last many weeks. And they're targeting, like just yesterday or the day before, they targeted a hospital called Tishrin and injured a number of people. And they're targeting civilians and densely inhabited areas, like in the old city of Damascus. And I have yet to come across any sort of outrage by the United Nations on this deliberate targeting of civilians, nor have they issued any sort of statement of outrage that I have found about Turkey's illegal bombing of Syria in the area of Afrin in the northwest, nor have they issued any sort of outrage that I can find of the illegal U.S.-led coalition's bombing of civilians' infrastructure and killing of thousands of civilians in Syria, and the mass destruction of areas of Syria and their infrastructure. Yeah. I'm sorry, the last point I just want to make about the UN is that they are serial censors of Syrian voices, particularly Syria's ambassador to the United Nations, Dr. Bashar al-Jafri. He routinely has his mic cut or is not allowed to speak unless he really forces them to allow him to speak, or he's assigned translators who, for example, some weeks ago, when he mentioned 1,000 shells on Damascus, the translator in question translated that to 20 shells, and that's a significant difference.
The heads of UNICEF, I mean, there was a former head, Anthony Lake, who was a former national security advisor with the Clinton administration. that speaks to conflicts that's not coming through. I mean, people are accusing you of being a Russian agent or Assad apologist or whatever, but here you have some real conflicts that there's no, full disclosure about. You have a comment that you'd like to introduce in that regard.
I do. First of all, I just want to address the whole Russian agent notion. So if listeners go to rt.com/op/ed authors, you'll find me. I'm an author in their opinion section, so it's not a blog as certain outlets like Channel 4 News or Snopes have insisted. It's simply an opinion section to which there are, last time I checked, 30 contributors. And my contribution, my last one, was on Palestine, actually, on Palestinian political prisoners, and it was in December. So it's not like I'm a regular contributor. Even if I were, there's nothing wrong with that. But I also contribute to Mint Press News, which has no affiliations with Russia whatsoever. And as I made a point in a recent panel in Derry, Northern Ireland, I said, RT does not censor me. I'm allowed to write what I see, what I feel, what I think. And if I tried to do this for CBC, or if the Guardian deigned to publish me, which I would not write for at this point in my life, but if I tried to, I guarantee they would change my wording, they would slash my article, they would not represent the full what I wanted to say. So I'm actually very honored to write for RT. But that said, I also contribute to Mint Press, I contribute to Sut.net, and a variety of other sites that pay a pittance, to be honest. And I also contribute periodically to Global Research. But more importantly, back to UNICEF. So when I was writing this article that was published on Mint Press over the UN's fake outrage, and not even mentioning the illegal Saudi war on Yemen, no outrage for Yemenis. I was curious. I came across an article. I forget the name of the author, but it's on Telesur. It's on the website Telesur, and it outlines how Anthony Lake, as you mentioned, was National Security Advisor to President Clinton, and at one point was nominated to be director of the CIA. And according to this particular article on Telesur, it said Lake played a significant role in mass starvation in Somalia 2010 to 12, under budgeting food aid, budgeting 10 cents a day per person to feed 1 million internally displaced persons. And that Lake publicly admitted he knew about and did nothing to prevent the genocide in Rwanda, something he quote-unquote regretted. So that's, a scary admission. If this was the head of UNICEF, the body that's supposed to have the welfare, well-being of civilians in conflict zones in mind, and he knowingly under-budgeted their food aid, knowing, just like the Israelis do, knowing that this will not be enough for the recipients to exist on. That's very telling about that particular branch of the UN. But then you have, when I was writing about Madaya in 2016, I looked at another body of the United Nations, the OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And when the Madaya media buzz was going on, OCHA was almost exclusively tweeting about terrorist-occupied areas of Zabadani and Madaya. And they weren't mentioning the terrorists. They were just putting forth the same rhetoric about the Syrian government starving people in Madaya. And as I pointed out in an article I wrote at that time, they mentioned only passingly the two villages of Fu and Kafraya, which are to this day besieged and to this day being bombed and starved. And they merit no outrage whatsoever for OCHA or for the UN. And OCHA could barely bring themselves to tweet about Fu and Kafraya, even though these two villages had been under siege, full siege, from March 2015 and partial siege years prior by the terrorist factions, and fully surrounded and being sniped and bombed on a daily basis. The UN did not, and we know why the UN did not find these villages worthy of merit of mentioning. It's because it doesn't fit this neatly packaged humanitarian intervention agenda, propaganda. So where, anywhere that terrorists are occupying, the United Nations, these human rights groups, the corporate media, Democracy Now!, they will conveniently omit the presence of the terrorists. They'll conveniently omit the fact that terrorist factions in these areas are firing upon civilians in areas outside of the besieged area. They will admit the fact that terrorists are hoarding the food and medical aid that come in, and any efforts the Syrian government and Russian allies are making towards providing a peaceful resolution to these areas.
You just heard a conversation with the award-winning Canadian journalist Eva Bartlett. Her articles on Syria and Palestine can be found at the site ingaza.wordpress.com. You're listening to the Global Research News Hour, broadcast out of Winnipeg on campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM and on partner radio stations across Canada and the United States. We are also podcast on the website globalresearch.ca. Tom Duggan is a British journalist who has resided in Damascus since 2013. Mr. Duggan has been intensely critical of the one-sided Western coverage of the Syrian conflict. What follows is an excerpt of a conversation the Global Research News Hour had with him on Wednesday, March 7th. He relates the carnage enacted on Damascus hospitals and schools from the East Ghouta-based rebels. He spoke of the attacks on humanitarian corridors by the rebels and of the damage from the sanctions imposed on the country. We apologize in advance for the poor quality of the recording.
This goes over the period of the last 7 years has shelled Damascus repeatedly, to a cost of 1,500 children killed so far over the last 7 years. 30,000 people maimed, loss of limbs, and around about 25,000 killed. That's approximately. So the Syrian government turned its attention up at the East Ghouta people amnesty to surrender or take them to Idlib. And they immediately started shelling Damascus. In the first day, the first month, there was over 1,000 shells landed in Damascus. Yesterday, there was 270 plus shells landed in Damascus. And I spent yesterday watching doctors put a young girl, a 17-year-old girl's brains back inside her skull, and she died later on. And that's the reality.
I understand there had been a ceasefire, at least between 9 and 2 in the afternoon.
Ceasefire between the UN that was brokered by the Russians and the Syrian army with the terrorists, and that ceasefire lasts from 9 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What happened yesterday was the terrorists shelled Damascus at 11 o'clock. They attacked the schools in Damascus. There were several schools hit, and then they attacked Jeremiah.
They talk about people in cages, that they put the militants are putting people in cages and using them as as human shields. Can you comment on that?
2 years ago in Joba, the same group that's in East Ghouta is from Joba. They put Halloween, Christian, and other ethnic groups that were in cages and put them on the rooftop and on the street so that the Syrian government wouldn't fire at them. I watched a child die yesterday. I was standing there watching them putting her brains back in her head. And it's not a pleasant sight. I watched a policeman come in with a hole in his leg. I've seen women who didn't know her daughter had died, and she was sitting and saying, all she wanted to know is if her daughter was okay, and we couldn't tell her anything because she had a big hole in her back. Who targets schools? Who targets hospitals? When I was in Aleppo, we discovered the headquarters of every terrorist group was in a school. They surround themselves with human shields which are children. It's not ethical. Nobody wants to report what happened in Damascus. Nobody wants to report what happened in Aleppo. It's all one-sided. I'm sitting here, and I can tell you now, I've seen people blowing up in front of me, and nobody reported. I've seen a car bomb go off. 19 soldiers were killed, and it wasn't reported. I've seen children in the streets lose their legs, and it's not reported.
Could you comment on how the sanctions have added to the crisis that you're facing now?
sanctions are killing kids. I lost a child called Jude not long ago. He had what you call water on the brain, which is hydrosyphilis, not syphilis as in sexual disease, but hydrosyphilis, which is water on the brain. We couldn't get the equipment in for the operation that we performed in Syria. We had to have a stint, which the tube that runs up to his stomach into his brain to drain it off. The stint didn't work. The child died within 17 days. We had him scheduled for a hospital in Malaysia to do the operation, all paid for, and he came down with chicken pox because his immune system was so low, and he died. And there was nothing we could do about it. Absolutely nothing. In Aleppo, they machine gunned all the X-ray equipment before they left. They left all the medical equipment out in the streets, all the medicines in the sun. They devastated on the medicines and bandages. In other words, urinated on them so they couldn't be used. We can't get spare parts in for scanners. We can't get spare parts in for X-ray machines. So they're cannibalizing all the equipment that's broken to keep the equipment running.
I was just wondering, because we're nearing the end of our time, do you have any urgent messages that you wish to convey to our listeners just before we close?
Yeah. Stop supporting sanctions. Do your best you can to stop sanctions so we can get medical supplies and medical equipment. Stop listening to mainstream media and start reading the facts. Start understanding who the white helmets are. Start understanding that al-Nusra is to Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda kills people in Bali, Australia, kills people in Paris, kills people in London, right? And also they killed people in New York. The Twin Towers was an Al-Qaeda attack. So how can the West support an organization that is attacking Syria, and helping them to attack Syria when Syria has never attacked the US, never attacked the UK, never attacked Paris? That's my message. You're supporting the wrong people.
Tom Duggan is a British journalist based in Damascus. His reports can be seen on the Tom Duggan Facebook page and YouTube channel. If the Syrian government is not a civil war waged by freedom-loving, democratic-minded rebels against a brutal totalitarian government, then what exactly are the issues and goals being masked by the humanitarian rhetoric? To answer this question, the Global Research NewsHour got hold of Patrick Henningsen, a past guest of this program. Patrick is a geopolitical analyst, the founder and editor of 21st Century Wire, and a regular contributor to RT and UK Column. He spoke to us from Austin, Texas. It seems to me that in the background, and this is something we don't hear very much about, that oil and energy politics play into the mix. As I understand it, the Syrian government had been brokering a pipeline that of natural gas pipeline that seemed to cut around some of the Qatari and U.S. interests and Turkish interests. Do you want to maybe explain some of that background? Because I think it's pretty important.
Yeah, sure. There are a number of competing pipeline projects in this region, and almost all of them are designed to deliver natural gas or oil to the Mediterranean, basically. So direct access to the European market. And then there's a whole number of gas plays right now, actually, along the coast, starting with Cyprus. So you have contested gas reserves there between Turkey, Cyprus. This goes back a while territorially between these two countries as well. And then you have Lebanon and Israel are also in conflict over a part of their overlapping, what they see as their gas reserves offshore. All of these yet to be exploited and very expensive. In fact, will require foreign investment. For all these countries would require foreign investment to realize the potential of these gas plays. So in the meantime, some people would see a more practical route is coming from the Pars gas field, for instance. This is one of the world's largest natural gas reserves, which is shared between Iran and Qatar. And Qatar is a small but wealthy Gulf emirate, which is adjacent to Saudi Arabia. And then Iran definitely does not have the ability to develop that at the moment, partly because of sanctions and a lack of foreign investment. And there's a whole conversation about the U.S. running point on the containment of Iran's economy via sanctions and other methods, but of coercion internationally. Okay, so the other option is from Qatar through Syria through to Turkey, and I believe in the Turkish port town of Selin, you already have potential for shipping oil directly to tankers and getting product then to the European market in another way. The other competing one, of course, is the controversial one, which would really be from Iran through Iraq to Syria, through to Tartus or Latakia, which would be in access to the European market. So you can tell Turkey would have definitely have a piece of the action with regards to Qatar. They're very close allies, so that's a natural partnership. Of course, the problem is what's in between Qatar and Turkey with regards to that. A lot of people don't realize that there is an oil pipeline which was operational before the creation of the state of Israel, which ran from Kirkuk or Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, from Kirkuk to Haifa in Israel. And that was shipping oil up until about 1949, and the Iraqis discontinued the flow of oil because of the situation with Israel, which was a burgeoning situation at the time. And so that pipeline, and also because of a number of attacks by Palestinian rebels, and also in Jordan as well. So it was unstable. Here's the problem with all of the competing pipeline projects, is to guarantee the safety and stability of that supply across that region right now at this point in time is not practical. And so I don't see the realization of any of these projects in the near future. Perhaps in the long term, maybe. And so this is where you have the practicality problem when you're looking at what's going on in Syria, for instance, and around it, and then you're looking at these competing pipeline projects and all the alliances that are attached to each competing project. And yes, there is a reflection between those interests, differences of what would be their favorite pipeline project, and then the sides that they're taking on the ground right now in Syria. So you can learn a little bit there, but in terms of practicality, very difficult. And I think even the major players would admit that.
Of course, there's also the long-standing enmity towards any Middle Eastern leader who's pursuing a kind of a pan-Arabic nationalism, which is pretty much close to what Mr. Bashar al-Assad represents. And so all the more reason to seek some sort of a regime change. But it does appear over the course of the last 7 years that a Libyan-style regime change, if that's in fact what was being attempted, has failed miserably, especially after the involvement of the Russians on the ground at the invitation of the Syrian government. So, are we pretty much at the point now where we can rule out that as a possibility?
I think in the Libyan style, yes. I don't think that could happen. I don't actually, now looking back at it, and also after having been to Syria myself with my colleague Vanessa Beeley, who's also been many times to Syria and reported on the ground there. But after seeing the way the country is laid out, the security situation, the overwhelming popularity that Bashar al-Assad has within his own country, and the lack of any viable opposition, and the sort of toxicity of the Islamist militant opposition, which are effectively terrorist groups or a conclave of various terrorist factions, So it's not viable, it's not practical. But I think what you had, and I'm going to make a pretty bold statement here. I think what you had with Syria is very similar. If you look at the plans to cripple the Russian economy by the West, in both cases, I believe the United States, the advisors who were advising President Obama, were looking in the case of Syria, we're looking at maybe a Syria pre-Russian alliance Syria, and so they didn't factor in Russia's entrance into the conflict. But even then, they underestimated the cohesiveness of the state, the nation's or sovereign state of Syria, just as they underestimated the cohesiveness and diversity of the Russian economy when imposing sanctions on it. So in terms of economic performance, Russia has weathered that storm economically with the oil crash, with sanctions, and diplomatically, strategically, geopolitically projecting its influence and success in places like Syria. In Syria, however, has been able to withstand a tremendous amount of economic adversity. Okay, but Syria doesn't have nearly the resources and the control of its borders that a country like Russia would have to withstand full-on economic warfare. Syria has been choked off, has been suffocated economically because of a joint raft of sanctions, not just the U.S., but the EU as well. Syria produced enough oil to export and do something like $10 billion a year in sales. Correct me if I have the figure slightly off, but around that in terms of annual sales with the European Union. And the biggest buyers of Syrian oil were Italy, Germany, and a few other clients. Okay, so the oil production in Syria, and then that funded the government, basically. Those oil exports funded the government. They're a large percentage of government for the government to meet its balance of payments. Russia is similar as well. The government, state-run functions and stuff rely on oil revenue, and also the tax as well on the oil. And it allows them to subsidize the price of fuel at home. Okay, so this was a good system up until 2011. And so what they had is not only that, you have the occupation of Syria's oil fields, the theft of Syrian oil first by ISIS, and then ISIS effectively handed it over to the Kurdish SDF forces, which are backed by the United States. So there's very few countries that could withstand hyperinflation, a loss of their energy sector, a loss of their industrial sector, hyperinflation, black markets, sanctions that won't allow basic medical equipment in.
I mean, you're speaking to the economic warfare aspect of the crippling of the economy is, offsetting any, actual regime change dreams. But I'm also wondering if you could address the issue of the Balkanization of the country. I mean, that's something that comes up, especially you brought up the Kurds just now, and talking about how it could certainly serve that can serve a certain agenda. I'm reflecting on what the Turkish incursion into Afrin, which was in response to attempts to arm the Kurds in that border area, create a kind of a border security force there. Is that an aspect, that Balkanization project, is that a plan B that we should be looking at seriously?
Yes, exactly. So right now you have a situation where the United States has gradually embedded itself in northern Syria, northeastern Syria, with its Kurdish partners, which are essentially Kurdish YPG, People's Protection Units, some of them rebranded as the Syrian Democratic Forces. This was a stunt pulled by the United States in 2016. And so you have this contested area along the northern border of Syria, which is Turkey's southern border. Okay, but here's the problem. Okay, it would appear that the U.S. and the Turkish interests diverge in the sense that the United States are partnering and arming Kurdish militias. And so these are apparently the sworn enemies of Turkey and Ankara. And this is a new Islamist Turkish state, by the way, that effectively, for all intents and purposes, suspended its constitution last year and gave the President Erdogan unprecedented powers. So this is a transition from the Kemalist secular democracy to something very close to a totalitarian system with a very heavy religious accent on it. So you look at this northern border stretching from northeastern Syria across to Afrin and then Idlib, and then you have close to the Latakia, which is government-held areas in the far west of Syria. Okay, so what's important here is that the Kurds of Afrin and the Kurds in further in Qamishli and Kurds in Manbij and Kurds in the further reaches of northeastern Syria. This is east of the Euphrates River. This is not a monolithic Kurdish group. Turkey will ally with more Islamist Kurds, and probably this is who the United States will have the most success with as well in Syria. And so this is why Turkey will tolerate the SDF and U.S. alliance to a degree. But like say the Afrin Kurds are more sympathetic, have been anyway, towards Russia, for instance. They've been working side by side with Russia. They have a better relationship with Damascus. And so the United States is not able to dominate Afrin. Turkey wants to encircle Afrin right now. It's sending its shock troops doing the forward operations, which are basically the same Islamist and terrorist organizations that occupied East Aleppo and some of these areas before East Aleppo was liberated. I'm talking about the Free Syrian Army, which is ostensibly a terrorist group. Ask any Syrian, and they will tell you they're guilty of some of the worst atrocities in this conflict. Nour al-Din al-Zinki, this is the group that beheaded the 12-year-old Palestinian boy Abdullah Isa. They're part of Erdogan's shock troop coalition. They're sending in, and then the Kurdish forces will be coming from behind. They've deployed Turkish forces, Turkish special forces as well. And so they want to sort of besiege the remnant YPG Kurdish militias there holding up in Afrin. The idea is to join Jarbulus, which is a border town further east, which is totally Turkish occupied. They're using Turkish lira as commerce, Turkish telecoms. Turkey's running electrical power lines, underground power cables to give power to that city. They've effectively taken over the Syrian city, which they originally invaded in August 2016 in Operation Euphrates Shield. And so this is what's going on in Afrin is Operation Euphrates Shield 2.0. But it's not clear if it's going to be successful, because although Turkey generally likes to maybe invade and conquer things that aren't going to put up too much resistance. Hence, that's why it's sending jihadi groups in to do the sort of the heavy lifting, and not Turkey itself, because sustaining heavy casualties for this president is still a tenuous situation domestically, politically.
The dynamics you're talking about, I mean, if even there is a desire to Balkanize Syria and undermine, and I mean, you see a lot of characters in play. I mean, Israel is involved as well, bombing out with their strikes outside of Damascus, and that. I mean, whatever the official line might be, it does seem like that's designed to put a further strain on the Syrian Arab army. So even if this is what the desire is, there's no guarantee that a Balkanized Syria, if realized, is going to be beneficial to any of these players. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I don't see, even if Turkey was able to occupy, which it wants to join Jarbulus, to Manbij, to Azaz, to Afrin, to Idlib, which is one of the remaining holdouts for al-Qaeda in the Idlib province. So it wants to control that line and to possibly absorb part of northern Syria into some kind of a Turkish-controlled area. And Erdogan has also stated publicly in the past that he wants Aleppo, that Aleppo belongs to Turkey. So there's that, but will they be able to actually administer and hold on to that? What are the odds of this? It's not clear. But but if you look past that, the impracticalities of Turkey controlling these areas, just like the impracticalities of the United States controlling Raqqa and this creating a new Erbil around Raqqa or around Manbij, or creating a Kurdish autonomous state. It's not practical. But when you look at what is practical, Turkey and the United States share one common interest, which is to weaken and fracture the government in Damascus and the country of Syria. So on that point, they're both absolutely working towards the same end. And if you look at their strategy, anytime you see things going in the direction in the favor of Damascus, you'll see fighting break out and operations breaking out that would possibly pull resources of the Syrian Arab army. So the idea is to overstretch the Syrian Arab army and wear them down in a war of attrition. This is what Turkey and the United States, I believe personally, that they're doing behind the scenes. That this spat they have is strictly superficial and academic in other sense of the word. But it's to overwhelm, and also Israel is backing. Clearly, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that Israel is also backing multiple rebel factions, especially the ones down in Quneitra and along the occupied Golan line in southern Syria. So that, again, is stretching the Syrian army's resources. So if you look at a situation like Ghouta, the reason they haven't been able to resolve this in so many years, not only because they're avoiding mass civilian casualties and trying to find a way to do this successfully, but also because they simply don't have the ground resources. They're stretched on 8 different fronts. Imagine fighting a war on 8 different fronts. How successful can any country or any army be? It's quite a miracle, in fact, that Syria has been as successful as they have, partly because of the help of their allies. But so I think that is part of the strategy. Then to peel off this piece of Syrian Kurdistan as semi-autonomous, semi-republic, a state that's not a state but a state within a state that the U.S. is occupying. And the big thing you need to pay attention to is nobody has fired a shot at the United States, who have multiple bases now set up in northeastern Syria. No one has fired a shot, really, and taken on Turkey. Both of those two countries are NATO countries. So under Article 5, if anyone was to hit any of them, their allies would be obliged to act on their behalf. And then you have potentially a bigger conflict and a bigger war. But if you look at it geopolitically in terms of not allowing Syria to control its own borders. And right now, the only borders Syria really has control of are its border with Lebanon. Okay, but the really important areas, it doesn't have full control of. It could if they are able to be successful in East Ghouta and successful in some of these other areas. They then will have the resources to deploy to secure their borders along Iraq, along parts of northern Syria. In fact, if the Syrian army moved into northern Syria, the Kurdish forces there couldn't do anything, and the U.S. might be forced to leave as well, because it's not practical at that point. They're only doing, U.S. and Turkey are only doing what they do because Syria does not have the resources on the ground to administer and protect all of its border regions from Jordan to Israel to Turkey and to Iraq. It does not have the resources to do that. And ISIS is still being allowed to fester by the United States in pockets. The U.S. has admitted this. You even look at statements by General Mattis a couple of weeks ago. We have them. We know where they are, but we're not going to engage them at the moment. They're letting ISIS basically be there in waiting as a territorial rooster, agent provocateur, to be unleashed at any time. If the U.S. weren't there, ISIS would be out of the country within weeks, totally eradicated. But because the U.S. are there, so the U.S. can't be in Syria unless ISIS is in Syria. It's a simple equation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we were both kind of at the end of our time now, but I want to thank you very much, Patrick, for breaking these very complex dynamics down for us. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michael.
And, of course, we've been joined by Patrick Henningsen. He is the founder and editor of 21st Century Wire, a frequent geopolitical analyst. He joined us from Austin, Texas. You've been listening to the Global Research News Hour. You can listen to our programs every week on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partnering radio stations across Canada and the United States. You can also download each episode from the website globalresearch.ca. To leave feedback on this program, email globalresearchnewshour@gmail.com.